This movie opens by showing a man named Joe. He was busy fixing his broken computer. Joe is a crippled man. His wife and child had died in an accident, which left both his legs paralyzed. One day, he was visited by a client who wanted to rent his room. The client was named Berta, and she came with her daughter, Betty. On her first day of staying, Berta told him that she was a club dancer, and she even seemed to seduce Joe with her style. But here, Joe is not attracted to the woman. Then, Berta accidentally finds a memorable photo of Joe with his family when they were alive. In the photo, it can be seen that Joe and his family are very harmonious, and Joe loves his family very much. From the photos, Berta knows that today is Joe's birthday. For that, she prepared a simple party on the rooftop. Berta tells Joe that her daughter hasn't talked to anyone for a long time. The psychologist advised her not to put pressure on the child, because she might not want to talk because she was under so much pressure. Then, because Joe mentioned Bertha's profession as a club dancer, Berta then showed her dancing skills in front of Joe. Seeing the tempting dance, Joe was giddy by Berta. Once, when Joe was in the basement, he heard a noise from the house next door. He then listened to the voice using the device he had. Apparently, there's a person who was planning something, and the person mentioned Joe's name. Hearing that, Joe started spying on the person using the computer he had made. Joe started punching holes in the walls to put hidden cameras so he could see what they were doing. After that, Joe returned to his job. He watched the people closely and finally he knew that they were planning a heist in the safe in the bank, which is located next door to Joe's house. They would dig the ground and make tunnels, and it turned out, upon closer investigation, that Bertha had been in cahoots with the man. She deliberately kept Joe busy with her so that Joe would not know about the thefts that those people had committed. The boss of the action is named Gallarito, who is Bertha's husband. Seeing that fact made Joe's heart broken and disappointed in Bertha. At night, Betty, Bertha's daughter, came to Joe who was sleeping. Joe was aware of Betty's presence beside him, and from this he knew that Betty was starting to feel sympathy for him. In the morning, Joe returns to spy on Gallarito and his men. He saw them pull out a box possibly containing the stolen money from the bank through the tunnel they had made. Then, Joe started taking the time to try to communicate with Betty. He started showing his sympathy to the girl. Bertha, who knew about it, looked touched. When Joe was pouring coffee, he accidentally saw Betty talking to his beloved dog. Later, Joe returned to watching the movements of Gallarito and his men. There, he saw that one of Gallarito's new men had made a mistake. Gallarito interrogated his new subordinate, and he ordered his men to tie the man to a table. Then, Gallarito began to interrogate him. As it turned out, his men sent the address of the bank they were about to steal to someone who was recognized as his girlfriend. Hearing that absurd reason, Gallarito got angry and killed the man in a quite extreme way. Joe, who saw the terrible action, looked hysterical. Then, after that, Joe approached Bertha. He started asking Bertha if she was in a relationship with someone else. Joe did this to test whether Bertha wanted to tell the truth or not. Not having time to answer questions from Joe, Bertha suddenly dizzy. Joe then took her to sleep in her bed, then he also injected anesthetics into Bertha so that she fell asleep within a certain time. The scene then switches back to Gallarito and his men. They looked like they were going to do an operation today. Gallarito had mentioned a box with a certain number and he forbade his men to touch the contents of the box. Apparently, the mastermind behind this theft is a man named Gutman. Later, Joe shows Bertha the heinous deeds committed by her husband. Bertha, who saw this, looked surprised and did not expect that her husband was that cruel. Joe also asked Bertha when was the last time her daughter stopped talking. Then, Bertha replied that ever since she married Gallarito, her daughter started to stop talking. From here we know that Betty didn't want to talk because maybe she saw the bad behavior of her stepfather. But she did not want to reveal it. Later, Joe returns to the basement. This time, Gallarito and his men ran into a bit of trouble with a buried water pipeline, which was blocking the tunnel that Gallarito and his men had made. Joe plans to take the money they stole with a hole he made through the tunnel made by Gallarito. Joe started to enter the tunnel to have a look and devise a strategy to get the money. But Joe was almost caught by Gallarito, who checked the condition of the tunnel at that time. While hiding in the tunnel, Joe overhears the conversation of Gallarito and his men. Gallarito looked suspicious of his henchman named Lefty. Luckily, Gallarito didn't realize that Joe was also in the tunnel, so Joe managed to get out of the tunnel safely. While looking for Betty, Joe loses her track. Joe, who realized that Betty might be in the basement, immediately rushed to the basement. And unfortunately, Betty got into the tunnel. And by this time she was in the next room, where Gallarito and his men were. Luckily, Betty had time to hide so that Gallarito didn't realize that Betty was there. Then, Gutman appeared in order to immediately complete this mission. After Gutman and Gallarito left, Betty returned to the tunnel and was pulled out by Joe until she finally survived and was in Joe's lap. But apparently, Betty stole Lefty's watch, and it would be very dangerous if Galarito found out. Then, Joe got Bertha to help him convince Galarito that everything was going according to plan. And after that, Joe returned to injecting anesthetic into Bertha so that Bertha would not mess up Joe's plan to stop the theft committed by Galarito. Here, it appears that Lefty is still looking for his lost watch. But he did not suspect that the watch was stolen by someone. Back to Joe. He then asked permission to lock Betty's room and he began to carry out his mission. Joe entered the tunnel, and he removed the explosive that Galarito was going to use to break through the bank floor. Joe moved the bomb near the water pipe that was there, and after that it crashed into the floor of the bank where they kept the money. Joe then took some money from the safe deposit box, then he left there. Until then, Galarito's men started the rob mission. They set off the bomb to make a hole in the bank floor and they started stealing money and other things. Shortly after that, the water pipes started leaking and water was pooling everywhere. Galarito's men were trapped there, while Galarito and Lefty and his younger brother instead left him trapped in the tunnel because he was afraid the floor would collapse. Joe also left the basement after covering the hole he dug. It turns out that 2 of Galarito's men are trapped and can't go anywhere. Finally, they decided to sound the bank's alarm. The police led by Gutman came to check the situation. They were about to search Joe's flooded house and cellar. Joe had refused them, but they insisted. With no other choice, Joe was forced to let them search his whole house. Gutman then gave Joe his phone number and told Joe to call him if anything happened. After Gutman and the police left, Galarito and his men came to Joe's house and forced to search Joe's house under the guise of police. Galarito began to interrogate Joe and asked if Joe was living with other people in his house. Joe, who doesn't want to have problems with Galarito, is forced to lie that he lives alone in his house. But unfortunately, Betty came out of the room when Joe tried to trick Galarito. Therefore, Galarito, who no longer believed in what Joe was saying, then began to interrogate him more deeply. Galarito's men began torturing Joe to get him to confess. But Joe never confessed. Unfortunately, Gutman called Joe's cell phone when Galarito was interrogating him. Things got even more complicated for Joe to escape from Galarito's threats. Then, when Galarito threatened to kill Joe with his gun, Joe spontaneously called out Lefty's name. Suddenly, this made Galarito even more suspicious. How could Joe know Lefty? Then Joe told them a story which he made up. Joe admits to having conspired with Lefty to recover some of the money which Galarito stole, using a lorry. Joe went into detail to make Galarito believe him. Then, Joe also showed them a watch belonging to Lefty, which he put in a cupboard. Joe said that Lefty accidentally left the watch at his house the last time he visited. Seeing the evidence, Galarito could not say anything and just believed Joe's words. Lefty, who had been cornered, was forced to kill Galarito's younger brother who pointed a gun at him, while Galarito killed Lefty with the gun he was holding. When he was about to kill Joe using his gun, luckily the bullets in the gun ran out. And now, Galarito can only cry over his dead brother. After that, Berta appeared and killed Galarito, who had ruined her life. Then, since Galarito and his men were dead, now Gutman just needed to bury them. He took their bodies into the trunk of his car. Then, Gutman, who was greedy for treasure, made a deal with Joe. Joe will give half of the money he got from the heist. In return, Gutman would keep quiet about the theft from the bank. However, Joe did not agree to that. He threatened back and would report Gutman with the video he made if Gutman messed with him. Then, Gutman took the food that Joe had previously drugged. He usually makes the drug to put his beloved dog to sleep. Gutman threatens to kill Bertha and her daughter if Joe doesn't give him what he wants. So reluctantly, Joe gave the money to Gutman. Gutman, who felt that he had got everything, left Joe's house after eating the cookie that had been drugged. Feeling elated, Gutman returned to his house driving his own car and with a bag filled with money from the theft of the bank by Galarito's men. But in the middle of his way, Gutman felt dizzy due to the drug that had entered his body, and he crashed into a car until there was an accident. Gutman's car trunk was open and Galarito's hand was clearly visible to those around the street. Gutman's car also caught fire, and he could only silently regret what he had done. Joe, Bertha, and Betty look happy and are going to build a new family, with Joe being a new father for Betty. They will also be moving out of the house they are currently living in. And, the film ends with a happy ending. Thank you to those of you who have watched this video. See you in the next video.